sharing. Well, it wasn't really sharing. We didn't have an official sharing duty. Just kind of sprung up on it. And I was reminded of years ago when it was the first week I was hired on as an assistant pastor in Pacific Grove. And God had put it into my heart that I wasn't going to be there very long. And I ended up telling the pastor that that's probably the last thing he wanted to hear. With the new guy he just brought on, I told him I wasn't going to be here very long. I didn't believe what the Lord was showing me. He showed me something else that I was reminded of as I was listening to you. Really, the vision that he gave me was to come over and equip the saints, just going through the scriptures, being led and empowered by the Spirit, and the people would be people that are just going out in their everyday life, whether it's walking your dog or going to the doctor's office or going to the grocery store or whatever you do during your day, and just would be a light and sharing Jesus along the way. He didn't give me a vision of huge church or planting churches or going to Africa or like he does with a lot of people, but that's not what he did with me. It was just going to be normal people, and it wouldn't be like we were Christians and were swinging in on the noon balloon kind of thing. Just, people that could speak to other normal people in a just real relatable way. Being who we are Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday, not being somebody different on Sunday than we are those other days, being normal. That's kind of the vision that God gave me. You're it. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the variety that you have and for your plans and purposes. And Lord, it's all about you. And there's many ways and various shapes and colors and varieties of people that you have in your kingdom. And blessings on all of them, Lord, and on your people. And I pray today that as we go through the scriptures, that it would make sense, because this has been pretty challenging on how to approach this. In Jesus' name, amen. And this has been pretty challenging, and Exodus 19, that's where we're at, and 20, we're going to look at. And it has to do with the law. And as I looked at various things, many of them I've looked at before, I didn't find anything that really approached this in a way that made any sense to me from a New Covenant perspective. And that was pretty amazing to me as I was reviewing a lot of different approaches to this. And so let's consider what we've gone through for a moment. As we've looked at Exodus 19, and we'll go back in and look at it a little bit before we move on. But God, through Moses, reminded the Israelites of his care and his love for them. Now, he does that for a reason. Because he wanted them to know that he cared for them and that he loved them. And I thought about that. That's a great model for us. Men, husbands, that's a great model. It's a great model for ladies and sisters that are here as well. That we should model to our families our care and our love for them. As he does, God does, with the children of Israel. And also, I think we should model our love for God to our children, to our families. And it sets a tone for our lives together. And and especially men, husbands, we are a type of Christ. We're to model Christ. And Christ is the initiator in his relationship with his church, right? And the bride is like the wife who responds to her husband. And I know that I can set the tone in my family for thumbs up or thumbs down. Just in the things that I say and the way that I act, the way I carry myself, and just what's going on in my life. I pass it on to those that are around me. And then they are either infected or affected. And so I want to be sure that I'm affecting them in a godly way as opposed to infecting them with some kind of disease like depression or discouragement or something like that. And so we can learn from that. And that makes me want to be sure that I'm putting on the mind of Christ, that I'm girding the loins of my mind with truth, that I'm allowing the very great and precious promises of God to influence me, not the disappointments of life or the discouragements that life can be at times. And so that I grab hold of the very great and precious promises of God and allow the grace of God to begin to touch me again in a real practical way in my home. So as I listen to this, and I want to read to you the first 6 verses of Exodus chapter 19. It says, in the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day they came to the desert of Sinai, after they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. And here it is. You yourselves have seen what I did in Egypt, to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." And so that we're clear on this, the obedience that God is speaking about is the obedience that comes from faith. See, even in the Old Testament, what God was looking for was faith. And God extended grace in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Salvation by grace through faith. In the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. And so his desire was faith. In fact, the Old Testament says, you shall stand by faith, you will not stand at all. Now, you say, well, weren't they under the law? We'll get to that. But salvation and being able to have a relationship with God has always been the same. It's by faith. And to show you that, in Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about Moses, and it talks about what he went through. And in Hebrews 11:24, it says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ. Now, Christ hasn't even been born yet, right, during that time. But he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger, and he persevered because he saw him who is invisible. And who's the him who is invisible? Christ, God. And so even before, long time before Christ came along, it says Moses saw him, and the actions and things that he was doing was based on a relationship with him. And so how did he have this relationship? Somehow, God revealed himself to him. And he knew about the very great and precious promises that had been given to the prophets before him. And he believed them. And he came into relationship with them. And in Hebrews chapter 4, in verse 1 and 2, it says this. Since the promise of entering his rest, that's God's rest, still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. Now the writer to Hebrews is speaking to those Hebrews that had been listening to the gospel, and some of them were turning away from the gospel, and they were turning back to animal sacrifices. So he writes to them, and he says, since the promise of entering God's rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the gospel preached to us, in other words, in his day, just as they, referring to the children of Israel, had the gospel preached to them. But the message they heard was of no value to them. So he's talking about the children of Israel. The gospel message that they heard was of no value to them because those who heard did not combine it with faith. Now some did, there were a few that did, but the vast majority did not. So, again, it talks about the necessity of faith. So, in Exodus chapter 19 again, we'll go back, and beginning in verse 7, let's continue. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people, and he said before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. We will do everything that the Lord has said. Now, there's different views about what that means. And as I said to you last week about doing everything the Lord had said, I don't know whether they were sincere. Maybe there was a mixed bag. Maybe some of them genuinely thought they were going to do everything that God told them. Maybe some were going along with the program. After all, they'd had some pretty scary things that came to their attention recently. And we don't know what caused them to say these things, but they said, we will do everything the Lord has said. Now, if we go to another passage of Scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 5, it tells us a little more about that scene. And that's the way the Scriptures are. Sometimes you look and find out more elsewhere. So in Deuteronomy chapter 5, in verse 28, it says this. Moses is talking to those Israelites later. In fact, this is just before Moses is getting ready to die. He speaks to them and he says, the Lord heard you, Israelites, when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard what this people said to you. Now, what he's referring to is that statement we just looked at in Exodus where they said, everything he said we will do. Right? So God is saying, I heard him. Now, he says, I have heard what this people said to you. Everything they said was good. So he's saying, when they said, everything you say we will do, he says that's good. But he goes on and adds to it, verse 29, God says, oh, that their hearts would be inclined to fear me and keep all my commands always, so that it might go well with them and their children forever. So he's saying, what they said is good, lip service. Oh, if they could only, if they only had the heart to do it. Now, if we go over to Deuteronomy, again, in chapter 30, verse 6, it says, the Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart, with all your soul, and live. So there was coming a time, he's talking about, where I will circumcise your heart. Now, what does that mean? We are dominated by our sinful nature the same way the Israelites were. And they couldn't do what God wanted them to do. And they're not convinced of that, apparently. But their heart needed to be circumcised. And God is saying, I'm going to cut away the hold of the old nature, the sinful nature we call the flesh. I'm going to cut it away so that you can love me. You need a new heart. The issue is the heart issue. And so, that's true today as it was true then. And so, in the book of Romans, it says a little bit more. If we look at Romans chapter 9, beginning in verse 30. What then shall we say that the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it? A righteousness that is by faith. But Israel, who pursued a law of righteousness, has not attained it. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works. And they did not attain it by works. And in Romans chapter 10, beginning in verse 3, he continues. Since they did not know the righteousness that comes from God and sought to establish their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Moses describes in this way the righteousness that is by the law. The man who does these things will live by them. In other words, if you can obey the law, then you will live by that. But if you can't obey the law, then you won't live. Now, when he talks about obeying the law, he's not talking about hit and miss and obeying it most of the time and not all of the time. He's not just talking about obeying the letter of the law, but obeying the spirit of the law. And nobody can do that. That's the bottom line. So Moses describes in this way the righteousness that is by the law. The man who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the deep? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth, and in your heart. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 30 again, let's go to verse 11. And I know I'm jumping around, but to make sense of this, it's a necessity to do it. In Deuteronomy 30:11, it says this. Now what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you. He's talking to the children of Israel. So it's not too difficult to you what I'm saying, or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven, so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven? He's actually repeating what's in Romans, that we just read. It is not up in heaven, so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us, so we may obey it. And the it that's being referred to is the word of faith, the commandment of God. And all the law hangs on two commandments. Love the Lord thy God with all your soul, heart, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law hangs on those two commandments. So it says, you don't have to ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it. Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it. No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may obey it. And that's the word of faith. He's looking for faith expressing itself through love. And so the Old Testament and New Testament are woven together. Now, we're going to go back and look at the end of the chapter 19, where he speaks to them in verse 15. He says, verse 16. Exodus 19:16, he says, on the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, and everyone in the camp trembled. They're in terror. All the people, the Israelites, are in terror. God is going to be encountering them. And remember, they said, everything we will do. When they said that, everything was altered. The relationship with God ceased to be this gracious, loving relationship where he brought them on eagle's wings to himself. But it became something else. Now remember what the law is for. The law is not for the righteous, but for the unrighteous. And the law is a schoolmaster. It's a tutor to bring people to a realization of their bankruptcy, to produce the life of God, and to obey his commandments. Not even the 10, just the 2. To love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, and all thy mind, and to love thy neighbor as thyself. They can't pull that off. We can't pull that off either. So, and as I read all these people that write about this, they don't even mention the purpose of the law with relationship to the new covenant at all. And I totally don't get that. I don't understand it. And I've read. I don't see anybody talking about that. See, it's not like expected them to keep his laws, and he was disappointed over that they didn't. God knew they couldn't keep it. I mean, he's God. He knew all things. But he gave them the law to bring them to the mercy seat of Christ, to realize that they needed him. I didn't say that. That's what the New Testament says. So everyone in the camp is trembling. And then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God. And I know they're not going, oh boy, now we get to meet with God. No, they didn't want God to talk to them. They're scared to death. And that's what the law ought to do. I'm going to read the law to you, and when you hear it, man, I hope there's a thankfulness in your heart for Jesus Christ. Because you have not kept the law, and I haven't either. So everyone in the camp trembled, and then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Couldn't go up on the mountain. And Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. And the smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. And the whole mountain trembled violently like a volcano. And the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. And then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. And the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up. And the Lord said to him, go down and warn the people, so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, dedicate themselves, devote themselves, set themselves apart, wash their clothes, get cleaned up, consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up Mount Sinai, because you yourself warned us and put limits around the mountain. You know, you can say you can go this far and no further. Well, how about just another inch? No, that's it. Limits. And he set apart, and he said, he put limits around the mountain and set it apart. It's holy. In other words, this mountain is holy and you're not. That's the point. He's a holy God, and he's not going to stop being a holy God just so that we can come near to him. It's going to take the blood of the Son of God to give us access into his holiness. That's how holy he is. Now he says, be holy as he is holy, because we belong to him. He's purchased us at a great price, at the price of his Son. And he says, be holy as I am holy. So is God into purity and holiness and being set apart and set apart for him, to behave in a certain way, to be a manifestation of his character and his nature? Is he into holiness that way? Yeah, he is. But we're under new covenant. He's still into holiness. He still cares about what we reflect to a world that is lost and in darkness. He wants us reflecting light and holiness and purity. And so just because we're under grace doesn't mean that the moral code that's given to us in the law should not be seen in our lives, but it can only be seen by grace through faith. Same way that it could be seen in the Old Testament. And the only way it can be seen in the Old Testament, no matter how much they washed their clothes, or whether they put Clorox on them, or Tide, or whatever it might be, it's not going to make them holy. Those things all dealt with external things, not with the heart. And God wants purity and holiness in our life, and that comes by partaking of his divine nature, by grace through faith, living out that moral code that the Old Testament talked about. Now, verse 24, the Lord replied, go down, bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people, and he told them. And he's going to give them the law. Remember, they're going to do everything. We will do everything that God tells us to do. Was their statement. And in Deuteronomy, God said, I heard what you said. You're going to do it. Oh, that their hearts would be inclined to do it. That they would come to mercies. Chapter 20, verse 1. God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God. Notice he says, I am the Lord your God. Is he your God?
Amen.
Do you know that? Does his Spirit live in you? Did his Spirit enter you? Because he who has the Son has life. He who has the Son has life. He who does not have the Son does not have life. Now, if you're here today and you don't have the Son, you're like all the rest of us at one time. We didn't have the Son, but we invited him into our lives. But it was more than just to invite him into our lives. We recognized that not only were we sinners, but at the very core of our being, we were in darkness, separated from God. And not only were we sinners, we were lost, and there was no hope for us apart from Jesus Christ, by his Spirit, coming to live in us. And when he entered into us, he gave us life. 1 John talks about that. He who has the Son has life. Who is not the Son of God has not life. So, what should you do? Should you say a sinner's prayer? If you mean it from your heart, you pray a sinner's prayer. That's fine. But continue to seek him. Continue to seek him. When you say that prayer, it may be that something might even happen before you even say the prayer, that he comes into your heart. Or it may be that it's during the time of seeking him. And I remember when I cried out to God, I began to seek him. And I grabbed hold of that Bible as if the truth was in it. And I began to read it from cover to cover for about 9 months. Just soaking it in. And God showed up. And he began to make those words alive. And they were just like coming right out of the page, right into my heart. And that's what will happen. Ask, seek, knock, and the door will be open. God will come. And God will give you life, as he promised to do it. But he tells you to seek. And he beckons you to come to him. Have you come to him? Have you sought him with all your heart? Seek him as if your life depends on it. Draw near to him. And trust him. I am the Lord your God, and who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He's our God. He has brought us out of the Egypt of the world. And we were in slavery, whether we knew it or not. We were in bondage to the various sin that we had given ourselves over to. And we lived in unbelief. Had no thoughts of God. In fact, when one tried to creep in, we would suppress it. When we began to feel guilty about certain situations, we would move quick to get out of the way of the light, so that we could continue to suppress truth and live in darkness. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And that word before can also be beside me. So you shall have no other gods beside me. And they're both true. You shall have no other gods beside me or before me. In other words, he should be ruling and reigning in our heart. Our attitudes should be the attitudes that please him. Our desires, the desires that please him. Our time used the way he wants it to be used. Our actions, the kind of actions that are led by him. In other words, everything brought into the lordship of Christ. Now, are we there? Watch out. Your nose is going to grow. Watch out. I think I see a couple. We're in process.
Amen.
I love that word, but don't use it as an excuse. Watch out, beware. We are in process. We're being transformed degree by degree into the image of Christ. And the degree is not much. Continue in that process. And as you continue in that process, Christ will be seen in us more than they see the old man. We ought to be real happy about that because the old man stinketh. With the new man, there's a sweet fragrance of Christ. So, you shall have no other gods before me. That's his heart's desire for us. Our affection should be set upon him. You shall have no other gods before me. In Matthew 22, I had this written down in my Bible, verse 37, so it must be something good. Matthew 22, verse 37. There was a man that came to Jesus, and he'd heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees and Pharisees. Remember when they tried to trick him by some of their questions? And Jesus had such wisdom that he just shut them out. And one of them, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. That's what his goal has always been. In the Old Testament and the New Testament. That we would know his love for us. Remember, he's the initiator. We're the responders. That we would know his love for us. And we would respond to him in like kind. Has God done anything for you recently? Has he extended any mercy to you or any goodness to you? Like the two little sheepdogs, mercy and grace nipping at your heels every day. Given us a beautiful day today, hasn't he? We'll be able to go out and enjoy that day. He promised never to leave us or forsake us. To be with us always, even to the end of time. He'll never leave you. Even if you're a stink bug, he'll never leave you. He'll be with you. He'll continue to work in you, will and do it his good pleasure. He'll continue to transform you. Whatever you're going through, I don't need to know what it is. God knows. And here's the other thing. He doesn't condemn us. He sees us every day, 24/7. Knows everything going on. Knows the good and he knows the bad. And he doesn't condemn us. He never stops his work to transform us. into the people that he wants us to be. And here's the deal. You're going to be a lot more than what you realize. And he's going to do a lot better than what you think he can. He's a God that says there's nothing impossible for me, not even you. I'm going to work in you, and I'm going to do something beautiful and great. And you know what? He also breaks us. He breaks this self-reliance. He breaks this selfishness. He breaks this stubbornness, of willfulness. You know, those times when we say, well, I'll never do that. And he works in us in such a beautiful way that we want his will more than anything in our life. I remember when I was so worried and fretting, there was a speaker that was coming to this little church that we were in. It was in Seaside. And there was a speaker there from Colombia. And he didn't speak English, but his wife was always with him, and she did. She translated. So I wanted to do the will of God. And he said, do you want to do it more than anything? And she translated. Yeah, I just want to know his will. And I was so concerned that I wouldn't know it or find it, or that I would zig when I should have zagged, or, you know. Have you guys ever gotten that way? Yeah, I think you have. And he said, don't worry about it. You will. You'll be right in the middle of God's will. See, God wants us to have that desire and then trust him. The steps of a good person, good because of Christ. The steps of a good person are ordered by the Lord. You're right where he wants you to be, doing what he wants you to do. Is your attitude always right? No. Are you a stink bug at times? Yeah. But he still promises, I'm with you. I'm working in you to will and do of my good pleasure. Doesn't happen overnight, bud, but we're still working on it, babe. God's at work. And all this work is good. Trust him for that. He's a good God. Now, don't use that as an excuse. Remember? Stay long, you can do that. But because of his great love, live out his moral code. And by the way, we'll talk more about that next week. If God will, I look forward to seeing you. Have a great day in Jesus. Amen.